One evening, as twilight deepens and the world sinks into silence, it's the perfect time to set aside the day's hustle and bustle and embark on a serene journey through ancient Greek legends, exploring the hidden corners of a heroic past. All you need to do is dim the lights, get comfortable, and let the evening's cool embrace carry away the day's worries, dissolving them into the encroaching quiet. There's something truly magical hidden within ancient lore, an elusive echo of bygone eras. They bear the imprint of centuries, the faint whisper of ancient campfires where people gathered, and the soft, lulling rhythm of voices that passed these tales down through generations for thousands of years, keeping them alive. This evening, by the light of a flickering lamp, we will trace the path of one great hero, from his very first breath to the completion of his final, seemingly impossible task. So dim the lights, perhaps turn on a fan for a gentle, lulling hum in the background, and let us begin our immersion into a world of myths, where reality intertwines with wonders. Picture this. You stand on the paved streets of ancient Thebes, enveloped in the warmth of a summer night. The air is thick with the scent of olive oil and freshly baked bread, wafting from bakeries that have just finished their day's work. In one of the city's modest yet respected homes, a woman named Alcmene is preparing to give birth to a child destined to become the most celebrated and legendary hero in all of Greek mythology. But this is no ordinary birth story. This is just the beginning of a grand saga that will unfold through 12 seemingly impossible labors. And the starting point for all of it was the rather complicated personal life of Zeus, the thunderer and king of all gods, whose actions often dictated the fates of mortals and immortals alike. As is well known from mythology, Zeus had a rather ambiguous reputation, and although his lawful wife Hera reigned beside him atop Mount Olympus, Zeus, alas, was characterized by unbridled curiosity and infidelity which led to numerous romantic escapades. He often assumed various guises and secretly visited mortal women, leaving behind offspring children in whose veins flowed both human and divine blood. These children, known as demigods, often led truly remarkable, adventurous lives marked by extraordinary abilities and great achievements. However, their existence was constantly overshadowed by the oppressive shadow of Hera's relentless jealousy, who did not forgive her husband's infidelities and unleashed her wrath upon his illegitimate children. Alcmene, however, was significantly different from most other mortal women whom Zeus honored with his attention. Throughout the city of Thebes, she was known for her impeccable virtue and unwavering loyalty to her valiant husband, Amphitryon. But Zeus, ever himself, saw this devotion as an intriguing challenge rather than an insurmountable obstacle. And so, one night, while Amphitryon was away on a distant campaign, participating in another war, Zeus assumed the exact likeness of her husband, meticulously copying his features and mannerisms, and appeared before her. Alcmene, genuinely believing it was her beloved husband returned home early, greeted him with undisguised joy and tenderness. This single night, full of deception and divine intervention, would change everything in her life, laying the foundation for future events. When the real Amphitryon returned the next day, Alcmene was deeply confused and puzzled by his accounts of the previous evening's events, which in no way matched her own memories. Her heart constricted with anxiety as she tried to make sense of what had happened. But by then, it was irrevocably too late. Zeus had achieved his goal, and Alcmene soon discovered with alarm and wonder that she was carrying the child of the king of the gods himself, Zeus the Thunderer, a harbinger of great achievements and no less great suffering. Now imagine yourself as one of the servants in that household, watching carefully as the months slowly pass. You begin to notice that Alcmene's pregnancy is progressing differently, not like other women's. The child kicks with unprecedented, almost frightening strength, its movements portending something extraordinary. At night, Alcmene is visited by strange, unsettling dreams, full of omens. Meanwhile, high atop Mount Olympus, the goddess Hera, Zeus's wife, gradually but inexorably uncovers her fickle husband's latest infidelity, and her wrath begins to mount, like an approaching storm. Hera's wrath was not solely fueled by jealousy, though that emotion certainly played a significant role, fanning the flames of vengeance. She was the patroness of marriage and the sacred bonds of family, and Zeus's endless amorous adventures were a personal, profound insult to everything she embodied and protected. But this child, this coming child, was destined to be special, marked for a great fate. Zeus had truly grand, far-reaching plans for him, and Hera simply could not, dared not allow it, resolved to prevent the birth and life of this demigod at any cost. And so the long-awaited night of birth arrives, and a thick, palpable tension hangs in the air, like the pressure before an imminent thunderstorm. Alcmene's labour begins with fierce contractions, her suffering intensifying with each passing minute. But something is wrong, something unnatural. Hours pass and then more, yet the child does not appear. The midwives, alarmed and bewildered, begin to whisper among themselves, their voices full of apprehension. The child should have been born long ago, but it seems as if some invisible, powerful force is holding back and restraining the natural course of events. What Alcmene does not know is that high atop Mount Olympus, driven by malice, Hera has sent Ilithyia, the powerful goddess of childbirth, to sit at Alcmene's very door. Ilithyia sits, legs tightly crossed and fingers firmly intertwined, using her irresistible divine power to completely halt and prevent the birth. This is an ancient form of dark magic, and it works flawlessly, binding life, causing Alcmene to suffer in the prelude to the inevitable. But, as often happens in ancient tales, there is always someone clever and perceptive enough to unravel an ingenious plan, someone capable of disrupting divine intervention. One of Alcmene's maidservants, a nimble and quick-witted woman named Galanthis, notices something very strange about the behaviour of the stranger sitting at their door. This woman had been there for long hours, completely motionless, silent, simply sitting in this unnatural, almost enchanted pose. Galanthis, possessing a keen mind, suddenly realizes this can be nothing other than divine intervention aimed at preventing the birth. And so Galanthis, without a second's hesitation, rushes outside and joyfully, at the top of her voice, shouts, "The child is born! The child is born! It's a beautiful, healthy boy." Ilithyia, utterly stunned by this sudden news, leaps up and in. Her astonishment uncrosses her limbs, and at that very instant, in a flash, the ancient spell shatters. Alcmene's labour immediately resumes, taking its natural, swift course. The infant is born with such a powerful and life-affirming cry that it seems to shake the very walls of the house, announcing the arrival of a new hero. The midwives gasp in involuntary astonishment and even slight fear when they finally see the newborn. He is larger than any infant they had ever delivered, and his grip is so strong that he nearly breaks the finger of the woman attempting to swaddle him. His eyes, barely open, seem filled with such intelligence and profound wisdom that it utterly belies his mere moments of life, foreshadowing his great destiny. He is named Alcides, meaning strength of Alcmene, yet history will remember him by another name, Heracles, which translates to glory of Hera. There's something truly ironic in that, isn't there? A child destined to spend his entire life desperately trying to appease the wrath of the goddess Hera, yet bearing a name that glorifies her. But Hera, of course, is not about to stop there. No, her vengeance is only beginning, and her next assault will be even more insidious and deadly. Just a few nights after the birth, as the household finally began to settle into some semblance of normal life, Hera made her next insidious move. 2 colossal serpents, sent by the goddess, silently slither through the night's darkness directly to the nursery, where the infant Heracles peacefully sleeps beside his twin brother, Iphicles. Yes, Alcmene had given birth to twins, but only one of them was the true son of Zeus, the other being Amphitryon's child. Imagine yourself a guard, patrolling the quiet, half-empty streets of Thebes that night. High in the sky hangs a full moon, casting long, wavering shadows between the ancient buildings. You hear nothing unusual, see nothing to arouse suspicion, for evil lurks within the darkness itself. But inside that house, behind its walls, something utterly extraordinary is unfolding, something that will forever change the understanding of strength and destiny. The serpents silently slip through the unlocked window, their scales emitting a barely audible, ominous whisper as they slide across the rough stone sill. These huge, massive creatures, sent by Hera herself in her relentless fury, possessed venom potent enough to instantly kill a dozen strong adult men. Their sinister eyes gleam menacingly in the dim moonlight as they slowly but inexorably approach the defenseless sleeping infants, anticipating their bloody massacre. Iphicles awakens first, his infant wail, full of genuine terror, filling the room, a natural reaction for any ordinary child encountering such a nightmare. His piercing cries awaken the parents, who rush in horror to the nursery, but by the time they reach the cradle, a sight awaits them that will be told in Thebes for generations, passed down as an incredible legend, surpassing all expectations. There, in the cradle, the infant Heracles coos with delight, holding a huge, writhing serpent in each tiny fist. He squeezes them like ordinary toys, and these formidable great serpents, living instruments of divine vengeance sent by Hera herself, lie dead, lifeless, their bodies limp in the infant's hands. The infant, who by all laws of nature should have been consumed by terror, instead bursts into joyous laughter, his face radiant with innocent mirth. The child, who should have been utterly helpless, displayed such incredible, unthinkable strength as simply cannot be possessed by someone barely a week old. Amphitryon, stunned, gazes at this incredible sight, and full understanding finally begins to dawn on him. His wife's mysterious pregnancy, the unbearable difficulties of childbirth, and now, this shocking display of impossible supernatural strength. This is no ordinary child, he realizes. This is the son of a god, An. Embodiment of divine power, destined for a great future full of labours and suffering, but above all, glory. From that fateful night, and for all the years that followed, every inhabitant of that dwelling clearly understood that under their roof, a truly extraordinary being, marked by the hand of the gods themselves, was growing and being nurtured. Heracles developed with unimaginable, truly supernatural speed and power that surpassed all human comprehension. Even as an infant, he possessed the ability to lift colossal stones that even the strongest and most seasoned men could barely manage. By the age of 5, he could effortlessly outrun the swiftest horses. However, along with this phenomenal strength came a heavy, relentless curse that pursued him throughout his life, the unquenchable, boundless enmity of the goddess Hera. As one can easily understand, this narrative is far from merely about an extraordinarily strong infant. It is but a prologue to a far more extensive and tragic epic about what happens when immeasurable divine power enters into irreconcilable conflict with vulnerable mortal life. Heracles did not choose to be Zeus's offspring. He did not ask for supernatural gifts, nor for Hera's eternal, merciless hatred. But from the moment of his miraculous arrival, his life's path was already irrevocably set. As young Heracles matured and grew strong, his adoptive parents, Amphitryon and Alcmene, selflessly strove to provide him with as normal a childhood as possible. They invited the most renowned tutors, Linus to teach the art of music and lyre playing, Castor for instruction in martial disciplines and combat, and the wise centaur Chiron to guide him in hunting and healing. But even in these seemingly peaceful pursuits, Heracles' true untamed nature inevitably surfaced. When Linus attempted to correct his lyre playing with a sharp, reproving remark, Heracles, in a fit of instantaneous indignation and uncontrollable rage, accidentally took his life with that very musical instrument. Such grievous incidents began to occur with alarming regularity. Heracles' incredible, colossal power, combined with his overly vehement, all-too-human emotional impulses, generated constant, intractable difficulties. He never intended harm, never sought to inflict suffering, but when you are dozens of times stronger than anyone around you, even the gentlest, most careful touch could result in irreparable harm. Meanwhile, high on the shining peaks of Olympus, the goddess Hera watched tirelessly and waited patiently. She had already understood that direct assaults would not yield the desired outcome. The boy proved too resilient, too robust, but endurance is a truly divine virtue, and Hera had all the time in the world, an eternity, at her disposal. She began skillfully sowing the seeds of a far more sophisticated and insidious vengeance, one that would turn Heracles' own incredible power against him. And so our hero grows into a mature man, beloved by his family, revered and admired by his entire city, yet carrying deep within himself not only the seeds of a grand destiny, but also the harbingers of inevitable tragedy. His birth was marked by wondrous marvels and terrifying monsters, and his entire life would henceforth be defined by the constant tension between his mighty divine heritage and his fragile yet resilient human heart. But what happens when that human heart, full of love and aspirations, is pushed to its very limit? What occurs when insidious divine manipulation meets a point of no return, a critical juncture for a mortal? The answer to this unsettling question lies in the deepening shadows that are already beginning to envelop Heracles' seemingly bright and promising future. Those very shadows we mentioned are about to descend upon Heracles' life in the cruelest and most unimaginable way. You are about to witness how even the mightiest and most invincible hero can be broken, not by external foes, but by insidious divine manipulation of his own mind, his very consciousness. Picture Heracles now, a mature man in the prime of his strength. He is married to the beautiful Megara, Princess of Thebes, and they have 3 charming children, filling their lives with meaning and joy. Their home is filled with ringing laughter and the familiar, comforting sounds of a happy family life. The children play carelessly, Megara hums softly as she tends her garden, and Heracles tells captivating stories by the crackling hearth in the evenings. You could pass their home on any ordinary day and see a scene that would seem the epitome of ideal, serene family happiness. Heracles, using his colossal strength, faithfully served his beloved city. He easily vanquished audacious bandits, reliably protected travelers on the roads, and even assisted with heavy construction work that ensured the prosperity of Thebes, his home city. His children joyfully clambered onto him like a living mountain, squealing with genuine delight as he gently but firmly tossed them into the air. But Hera watched all of this with mounting, burning irritation. Here was Zeus's illegitimate son, not only surviving but thriving, finding happiness. He had love, deep respect, a loving family. Everything that, it seemed, should make him truly content, and that, for Hera, was utterly unacceptable, intolerable. She had already attempted direct attacks and failed utterly. Now she would try something far more sophisticated and insidious, something that would undermine him from within. As you understand, the cruelest punishments often turn out to be those that transform our greatest strengths into our worst, most destructive weaknesses. Heracles' power had always been his defining characteristic, his pride and shield. But what if that strength suddenly became utterly uncontrollable, unmanageable? What if that very power, which had made him a great hero, turned into the instrument of his own greatest and irreplaceable tragedy? Hera sends Lyssa, the grim goddess of mad, all-consuming fury, to visit Heracles, to infiltrate his mind. This is not the madness that manifests in wild fits, causing one to babble and foam at the mouth. This is something far more subtle, insidious, and thus even more terrifying. It is a madness that creeps in unnoticed, slowly, like a poisonous fog, gradually distorting perception, twisting reality, until one completely loses the ability to distinguish friend from deadliest foe. The madness begins its destructive work on a seemingly ordinary and unremarkable evening. Heracles returns home after a long day spent helping farmers. He had been moving enormous boulders from their fields. He is tired, but feels satisfied and looks forward to a warm dinner with his beloved family. But as he approaches his home, something suddenly feels wrong, unsettling. Familiar, accustomed sounds suddenly begin to be perceived differently, distorted. The ringing laughter of his children now sounds. Ominous, threatening, and in Megara's voice calling them to dinner, he hears a hidden, insidious undertone of conspiracy. Imagine yourself a neighbor, perhaps simply tending your small garden as dusk settles over the city. You notice Heracles standing perfectly still by his front door, his head tilted as if listening to something only he can perceive. A strange, ominous tension can be felt in his powerful shoulders, a tension not present that morning. His hands, usually so gentle and affectionate with his family, are now clenched into tight, menacing fists. Inside the house, Megara and the children are completely unaware of the approaching doom. She is busy preparing the evening meal, bread, still warm from the oven, olives from their own tree, cheese brought from the market. The children are engrossed in a game, full of running and infectious giggles. It was a scene that should have warmed any father's heart, filled it with love and peace. But when Heracles finally crosses the threshold of his home, he no longer sees his family, his loved ones. Lyssa's sinister influence has so profoundly and irrevocably distorted his perception that he now sees enemies everywhere, in every corner of his house. His beloved, loyal wife appears to him as a mortal threat that must be immediately eliminated. His precious, defenseless children seem to him like the offspring of his deadliest foes, sent to destroy him, to erase him from the face of the earth. The tragedy unfolds with truly horrifying, unimaginable speed, leaving behind only chaos and pain. Heracles, convinced in his madness that he is desperately defending himself against cruel attackers, uses his colossal, inhuman strength to fight what he perceives as monsters and deadliest enemies. But there are no monsters. There are no enemies. There is only his loving, endlessly trusting family, who could never have foreseen that the blow would come from the most familiar hands. When the veil of madness finally lifts, Heracles finds himself standing in the midst of his own home, surrounded by utter devastation and unimaginable chaos. The horrifying reality of what he has done crashes over him like an icy, crushing wave. His wife, his children, all dead by his own deadly hand. The very strength that was meant to protect them had become the instrument of their complete destruction. Imagine that piercing moment when his mind fully clears, and the dark shroud of madness finally dissipates. The late evening light streams softly through the window, illuminating a scene of such unbearable suffering and all-encompassing horror that it seemed even the immortal gods themselves might shed bitter tears. Heracles, the mighty Heracles, falls to his knees, his colossal, once unshakable power utterly helpless before the unbearable weight of grief, despair, and all-consuming horror. He lets out a piercing shriek filled with inhuman agony, and people throughout Thebes, hearing it, stop all their activities, freezing in anxious anticipation of impending doom. Struck by this sound, like a soul shattered into pieces, neighbours rush to the house but stop at the threshold, petrified by the scene that unfolds before them. There he is, the great hero of Thebes, a man who could single-handedly fight lions and move mountains, now reduced to inconsolable sobs over the bodies of his own shattered family. Some begin to whisper that this must be a terrible divine punishment. Others simply stand in deep, stunned silence, unable to utter a word. News of the unimaginable tragedy spread like wildfire through the city. By morning, every inhabitant of Thebes knew what had transpired in the great hero's home. But the question that tormented everyone was the same one that relentlessly tortured Heracles himself. How could someone so profoundly decent, inherently good, commit something so monstrous and unspeakably evil? The answer, of course, lay with the insidious goddess Hera and her cruel, merciless manipulation. However, knowing this truth did not dull the sharpness of his grief, nor lighten the burden of guilt for his tormented soul. Heracles might have been merely an unwitting and blinded instrument of this nightmarish tragedy, but the blood on his hands remained a real, tangible substance, and the love he had lost was gone forever, irrevocably. For many agonizing days, Heracles refused food, drink, and any communication with anyone. He sat in his desolate, ruined home like a living statue staring into the bottomless void. Friends and comrades tried to approach him, but his grief was so profound and all-consuming that any words seemed utterly inappropriate and meaningless. What can one say to a man whose greatest power has become his most terrible, most destructive curse? Finally, only his young nephew, Iolaus, managed to break through this impenetrable wall of despair. Iolaus was young, only a little older than a boy, but he had always admired his uncle and held him in deep reverence. He quietly sits beside Heracles, attempting neither empty solace nor futile explanations. He simply sits there, sharing the heavy, oppressive silence with him. After a long, agonizing stillness, Heracles finally speaks, his voice barely audible, little more than a whisper. I killed them. I killed my own family, my loved ones. How do I live with this? How do I survive this? Iolaus, possessing a wisdom beyond his young years, did not attempt to diminish the horror of what had occurred, nor offer him easy or false absolution. Instead, he uttered words that would forever change the trajectory of Heracles' life, setting it on a completely new course. Uncle, you cannot bring them back. That is impossible. But perhaps you can make their deaths acquire a deep and meaningful purpose. Perhaps you can find a way to serve others with such complete dedication and selflessness that their memory will be transformed into a blessing, rather than remaining an eternal curse, burdening your tormented soul. This profound dialogue sowed the first seed of a new idea in Heracles' soul, one that would ultimately lead him to the sanctuary of the Delphic oracle, in search of answers and guidance. But first he had to find some way to come to terms with the terrible deed he had committed, to learn to live with this unbearable burden. And so he begins to wander, leaving Thebes forever, no longer able to bear the sight of the home where his beloved family's lives had ended. For many months he roamed the Greek countryside like a restless ghost, devoid of any peace. He helped wherever he could, clearing roads of bandits, rescuing travelers from fierce beasts. But he found no comfort or joy in these heroic deeds. For him it was merely a heavy penance, not a cause for celebration or self-satisfaction. During this era of deep reflection and solitary wanderings, Heracles gradually crystallized a new life philosophy for himself, one that would become his guiding star in the difficult trials to come. He realized that strength devoid of wisdom is truly dangerous, and power without humility inevitably leads to destruction and chaos. He began to deeply understand that true heroism lies not in possessing the greatest strength or the bravery of a warrior. It lies in selfless service to others, especially when that service demands everything one has, even at the cost of one's own life and well-being. The grief he endured changed him fundamentally, to the very depths of his being. The careless self-confidence of his youth had vanished, replaced by a far deeper and keener awareness of human fragility and vulnerability. He learned that absolutely anyone, however powerful or well-intentioned, can fall victim to circumstances and forces entirely beyond their control. This bitter revelation made him significantly more compassionate towards the failures and shortcomings of others, and far more determined to dedicate the remainder of his life to selfless service to those desperately in need of protection and support. However, the fundamental question remained unanswered. What specific form should this redemptive service take? How could one atone for something truly unforgivable, something so monstrous? The answer would come from the most unlikely and utterly unexpected source, from the very cousin who had always harbored black envy for his immense power, and now intended to use that very strength to humiliate him in a way that would make even the immortal gods feel awkward. Sometimes the path to true redemption sometimes leads through a deep valley of humiliation, and sometimes that is precisely where a broken and shattered hero must go to regain his wholeness, to heal, and to be reborn into a new life. The road to redemption led Heracles to sacred Delphi, where the oracle uttered her prophecies through riddles and clouds of fragrant smoke. Her words still echoed in his stunned mind as he walked the dusty road leading to Tiryns. Serve Eurystheus for 12 years. Complete all the tasks he sets for you. Only then will you be cleansed of your guilt. One might wonder how such a mighty hero as Heracles came to be bound to serve his faint-hearted cousin Eurystheus. But this was precisely what the insidious Hera desired. She cunningly arranged for Eurystheus to be born moments before Heracles, thereby making him the rightful king of Tiryns, and granting him the legal right to command the son of Zeus himself. It was a true masterpiece of divine intrigue, skillfully leveraging Heracles' deep sense of honor to trap him in servitude. Picture the scene when Heracles first arrived at the palace in Tiryns. Eurystheus had built himself an underground bronze chamber, a kind of bunker, where he could hide whenever his formidable cousin came to visit. The irony of the situation was almost palpable. The ruler so trembled before his own subject that he literally had to burrow underground to feel safe. But today, for the first labor, Eurystheus forced himself to appear in person. He sat on his throne, attempting to project an air of majesty, while his hands trembled slightly. Heracles knelt before him, and one could see the internal struggle on the hero's face. Every instinct screamed at him to refuse this humiliation, but the promise made to the oracle held him firm. "Your first task," Eurystheus announced, his voice slightly trembling, "is to kill the Nemean lion and bring me its hide as proof." Now, you might think that sounds simple enough. Heracles had fought dangerous animals before, but the Nemean lion was far from an ordinary beast. This creature was a terrifying offspring of a monstrous union. Its mother was a half-woman, half-serpent named Echidna, and its father was the giant Typhon, who possessed 100 dragon heads. The lion itself was colossal in size, its golden fur gleamed like impenetrable armor, and its claws could tear through even the strongest shields. Most importantly, the Nemean lion's hide was absolutely impenetrable to any mortal weapon. Swords bent, spears shattered, and arrows bounced off it without causing any harm. For 30 years, this creature had terrorized the hills around Nemea, mercilessly killing livestock, travelers, and anyone foolish enough to try and hunt it. Entire villages had been abandoned due to its ominous presence. Heracles accepted this task without a single complaint. Though a deep thoughtfulness was visible in his gaze, he was now learning to think before acting, to plan meticulously, rather than simply relying blindly on his immense strength. This newfound wisdom, forged in the crucible of recent tragedy, would serve him well in the trials to come. The journey to Nemea took several days, and Heracles used this time to gather valuable information. He stopped at taverns and farms, speaking with everyone who had encountered the formidable lion or seen its victims. The information he gathered was deeply unsettling. The beast not only possessed monstrous strength, but was also exceedingly intelligent. It hunted strategically, setting cunning ambushes and learning from its experiences with previous hunters. One evening, camping by a quiet stream, Heracles met an old shepherd who had lost his entire flock to the lion. "It's unnatural," the old man said, poking the embers with a stick. "Animals don't usually play with their prey, but this one seemed to enjoy the killing, leaving half the sheep untouched, just scattered, as if trying to prove something." This conversation only confirmed what Heracles had begun to suspect. The Nemean lion was not merely a ferocious animal. It was a true monster in every sense of the word, a creature embodying pure, uncontrolled, destructive force. To destroy it meant not only to overcome colossal physical danger, it would require outsmarting its cunning and malicious mind. A silence, presaging a storm, enveloped the Nemean region when Heracles finally arrived. The signs of the lion's presence were everywhere, like an invisible artist had left grim brushstrokes. Trees were scarred with deep claw marks, reaching 8 feet high from the ground, as if some colossal beast had been sharpening its deadly tools. The few remaining farms, once peaceful pockets of rural life, now resembled fortified military camps, their inhabitants living in constant fear. The very atmosphere seemed permeated with a sense of imminent threat, as if the earth itself held the memory of the unbearable terror that had stalked it. Heracles, with his characteristic caution, set up his camp in a grove of olive trees, which offered an excellent view in all directions. He dedicated the first night solely to observational analysis, using his heightened senses to meticulously map the lion's domain. Around midnight, a sound reached him that shook the very ground and sent all other creatures in the vicinity fleeing in absolute silence. It was a roar proclaiming absolute dominance, the sound of a predator so confident in its unmatched power that it saw no need for stealth. The next morning, Heracles began his hunt with utmost seriousness. He relentlessly followed the lion's trail through rocky valleys and dense thickets, meticulously noting the creature's movement patterns. The tracks left on the ground eloquently spoke of the beast's colossal size and its astonishing grace. This was a hunter capable of moving silently at will, despite weighing as much as a small horse. For 3 days they circled each other, as if in a deadly dance. Heracles only occasionally caught a glimpse of golden fur flickering in the undergrowth. The lion, for its part, seemed to be studying him with the same intensity that the hero was studying it. In these fleeting encounters, Heracles sensed an intelligence that made him inwardly shudder. This was not merely a predator tracking prey, but a monster assessing a potential threat. On the 4th day, Heracles decided to test his theories regarding the lion's invulnerability. He took a position on a high ridge which offered a clear view and loosed his best arrow, guided by all his skill and supernatural strength. The arrow struck the lion's shoulder precisely, but harmlessly bounced off. The beast didn't even flinch. Instead, it turned to look directly at Heracles, baring its fangs in what could only be described as a sinister grin. That night, alone by his fire, Heracles wrestled with the intractable problem. His sword could not cut the hide. His arrows could not pierce it. Even his club, carved from an olive tree and hard as iron, seemed inadequate against these supernatural defences. How to kill that which cannot be killed by ordinary means? The answer came to him gradually, like an epiphany, based on careful observation and impeccable logic. If the hide couldn't be breached from the outside, what about from the inside? If traditional weapons were useless, what about the only weapon he always carried, his own hands? The plan he devised was incredibly dangerous. He needed to get close enough to the lion to grapple with it hand to hand, close enough for those terrible claws and fangs to reach him. But it was the only approach that could work. He would have to strangle the beast, using its own strength against itself. The final showdown unfolded in a narrow valley with steep slopes, a natural arena where neither combatant could retreat. Heracles entered the valley at dawn, making no attempt to conceal himself. He wanted the lion to know he was coming. He wanted it to be a fair fight, predator against predator. The Nemean lion emerged from its lair, like molten gold taking the form of death. It was even larger than Heracles had anticipated, with a mane that seemed to glow with its own light. For a moment, they simply stared at each other, the monster that had terrorized the region for decades, and the hero who had come to end its reign. Then the lion charged, moving with shocking speed for such a large creature. Heracles did not attempt to dodge or use a weapon. Instead, he met the attack head-on, wrapping his arms around the beast's neck just as its claws raked his chest. The pain was immediate and intense, but Heracles held on. What followed was less a battle and more a contest of pure will and endurance. The lion thrashed and roared, attempting to shake off this impossible prey that refused to die. Its claws tore at Heracles' back and sides. Its weight threatened to crush him, but Heracles maintained his grip, slowly but inexorably tightening his arms around the creature's throat. Minutes passed. The lion's struggles grew more desperate, then gradually weakened. Heracles felt his own strength waning from blood loss and exhaustion, but he did not loosen his hold. This was what he had learned from tragedy. Sometimes victory requires sacrificing everything, including the certainty of survival. Finally, the great beast shuddered and went still. The terror of Nemea was dead, killed not by sword or spear, but by the simple, terrifying force of human determination. Heracles loosened his grip and fell back, gasping and bleeding, but alive. However, the task was not yet fully complete. Eurystheus demanded the lion's hide as irrefutable proof, and obtaining that hide proved almost as difficult as killing the beast itself. One must remember, nothing could penetrate that golden fur, not even in death. Heracles tried every blade he possessed, but all were powerless to inflict even the slightest cut. Then it dawned on him. If nothing from the outside could pierce the hide, what about the lion's own claws? Using one of the creature's razor-sharp claws, Heracles carefully skinned the beast. It was slow, painstaking work, but in the end, he had the complete hide, a gleaming golden fur that would become his signature attire. When Heracles returned to Tiryns, wearing the lion's hide as a cloak, the effect on Eurystheus was immediate and profound. The king took one look at his cousin, bloodied, wearing the hide of the unkillable monster, carrying the creature's massive head as a helmet, and fled in panic to his underground chamber. From then on, Eurystheus would only communicate with Heracles through a herald. He was too terrified to face the hero directly. And perhaps this was a wise decision, because something had changed in Heracles during this first labor. He had learned that even the impossible could be overcome with the right combination of courage, intelligence, and a sheer, stubborn refusal to give up. But standing in the empty throne room, listening to Eurystheus's muffled voice emanating from the bronze chamber below, Heracles knew this was only the beginning. 11 more labors awaited him, and Hera's influence was growing with each success. The questions that would haunt him throughout his trials were already forming. What happens when courage is not enough? What trial can break even the man who had strangled the unkillable lion? The golden lion hide gleamed in the morning sun as Heracles made his way to Eurystheus's bronze chamber. News of his first triumph had spread throughout Greece, and people lined the roads for a glimpse of the hero who had accomplished the impossible. But Heracles barely noticed their attention. His thoughts were already turned to the next trial that awaited him. From the safety of his underground bunker, Eurystheus's voice echoed through the speaking tube. It was an ingenious invention, allowing him to issue commands without facing the terrifying sight of his successful cousin. "Your second task," the king announced, his words distorted by the bronze walls, "is to destroy the Lernaean Hydra. And this time, you will go alone." This last detail was crucial. Having witnessed Heracles defeat the Nemean lion, Hera had whispered valuable hints to Eurystheus. No assistants, no companions. The hero was to face this monster in complete isolation, relying solely on his own strength and ingenuity. However, Heracles had learned a valuable lesson from his nephew about the nature of heroism and loyalty. As he prepared to leave Tiryns, he found the youth waiting by his chariot, armed and ready for the journey. "The king said you must face the Hydra alone," Iolaus said, with a slight smile. "But he said nothing about you not having a charioteer for the journey." Picture these two as they rode towards Lerna, the great hero in his lion hide and the eager youth who refused to be left behind. Their relationship had deepened since that terrible night when Iolaus first broke through Heracles' grief. Now, a light camaraderie had settled between them, a friendship that didn't require constant words to affirm its strength. The landscape steadily changed as they approached the swamps of Lerna. The air grew thick and humid, carrying the heavy scent of stagnant water and decay. The trees took on a twisted and sickly appearance, their branches seeming to reach towards the sky in tormented agony. Even the sunlight seemed dimmer here, filtered by the constant mist rising from the marshes. The local inhabitants they met on the road told stories that unsettled even Heracles. The Hydra was not merely a monster, it was a veritable plague upon the land. Its breath was so poisonous it killed vegetation for miles around. Its very presence tainted the water and soil. And worst of all, the creature possessed 9 heads, each capable of independent thought. "My grandfather saw it once," an old farmer said, his hands trembling as he spoke. "Said it was like a nightmare come alive. The heads would argue with each other about which way to drive their prey. But when they agreed on something, God help whoever they were hunting. As they drew closer to the Hydra's lair, the signs of its influence became impossible to ignore. Dead fish floated belly up in streams that should have teemed with life. Birds fell from the sky, having flown too close to the marsh. Even the insects seemed strange, too large, too aggressive, altered by the monster's venom. Heracles and Iolaus made camp on a hill overlooking the swamp. They positioned themselves as close as possible without risking exposure to the creature's toxic breath. From their vantage point, they could see the Hydra's lair, a massive spring where dark water bubbled up from deep underground caverns. The spring was surrounded by the bleached bones of countless victims, both animal and human. That evening, as they planned their approach, Heracles shared his observations with Iolaus. "We have more to worry about than just the poison," he said, surveying the lair in the deepening twilight. "Look at how those bones are scattered. The Hydra doesn't just kill, it plays with its food." Indeed, the arrangement of the bones suggested a creature with a cruel intelligence. Some skeletons were posed as if they had tried to crawl away as death overtook them. Others were stacked in neat piles like trophies. This was not the indiscriminate slaughter of a mindless beast. This was the deliberate work of something that took pleasure in inflicting terror. The next morning marked the hero's first direct encounter with the monster. Heracles, true to his word, approached the spring in complete solitude. While his loyal nephew Iolaus remained at a safe distance, managing the chariot and horses, their initial strategy seemed straightforward: lure the Hydra from its lair, engage it in battle, and trust that the Nemean lion's hide would provide sufficient protection against its deadly venom. However, they had not accounted for one thing: the mythical creature's astonishing patience. 4. Many hours Heracles stood at the edge of the swamp, provoking the monster, throwing stones into the water, and even loosing flaming arrows, but all was in vain. The spring remained still and dark, showing no hint of life within its depths. It was only when Heracles, frustrated by the seeming lack of response, turned to leave that the Hydra made its move. The water suddenly erupted as something colossal rose from the spring. First one head appeared, then another, and another, until 9 writhing serpentine necks towering above the surface, resembling a forest of malicious moving trees. The creature's body, when it fully emerged, was even more terrifying than ancient tales had suggested. It was the size of an elephant, covered in dark scales that gleamed ominously with moisture. Each head possessed unique features. Some had horns, others frills around their necks, still others multiple rows of fangs, but all were unified by identical burning red eyes and an expression of intelligent, merciless hatred. The monster's attack came from all directions at once. 9 heads struck independently, each attempting to corner Heracles while the others provided support. It was akin to fighting 9 different snakes simultaneously, each seemingly learning from the successes and failures of its kin. Heracles' first instinct was to use his powerful club, and at first this seemed to bear fruit. A mighty blow crushed one of the smaller heads, sending the creature recoiling with a piercing wail of pain that echoed from its remaining 8 mouths. But then, to Heracles' horror, something unthinkable occurred. Where one head had been destroyed, 2 new ones began to grow. This was the Hydra's most terrifying ability, one that no amount of force could overcome by direct. Assault. Each severed head regenerated into 2, making the creature stronger, not weaker. Heracles realized with mounting despair that his usual approach, overwhelming force applied with determination, would only make his enemy more powerful. The battle became a nightmarish dance of dodging and weaving as more heads sprouted from previous wounds. What began as 9 opponents soon became 11, then 13, then 15. The Hydra's poisonous breath grew more concentrated as its numbers increased, forcing Heracles to fight while holding his breath and keeping his eyes half closed against the toxic fumes. However, let us not forget Iolaus, who watched the scene from his seemingly safe distance. The youth quickly realized that conventional tactics would not work in this situation. This was a puzzle disguised as a battle, and it needed to be solved, not merely fought. He remembered stories of regenerating monsters from his childhood, tales in which fire was always the key to ultimate victory. Acting on sudden inspiration and spurred by desperate courage, Iolaus drove the chariot directly into the thick of the battle. He leapt down with a blazing torch, reaching the Hydra just as Heracles severed another head. Before the wound could heal, Iolaus pressed the torch against the next stump, cauterizing it with searing flame. The effect was immediate and decisive. The cauterized wound did not regenerate. Instead, it sealed permanently, leaving the Hydra with one fewer head and no ability to replace it. Heracles immediately understood the significance of this action and gave his nephew a smile of pure admiration. What followed was a dance of perfect coordination between the hero and his loyal helper. Heracles struck with surgical precision, severing heads one after another, while Iolaus followed with his torch, sealing each wound before the regeneration process could begin. This demanded instantaneous timing and absolute trust in one another. A moment of hesitation, and the Hydra's numbers would spiral out of control. The monster, realizing what was happening, grew increasingly desperate. Its remaining heads struck with renewed frantic fury, attempting to kill both heroes before they could continue their systematic slaughter. Poison sprayed in all directions. The creature's massive body thrashed in convulsions, attempting to crush them with its colossal weight. But Heracles and Iolaus found their rhythm. Head after head fell from powerful club blows and was sealed by searing. Flame. 9 heads became 8, then 7, then 6. With each success, the Hydra's coordination suffered. The remaining heads began to panic, striking wildly instead of working in concert. When only one head remained, the Hydra made a final, desperate attempt to flee. It began to retreat towards the spring, hoping to reach the safety of the water's depths, where the heroes could not follow. But Heracles would not let it escape. He leapt onto the creature's back, riding it like a bucking horse as he aimed his club for a final, decisive blow. The last head fell to the ground with a wet thud, and Iolaus's torch brought the Hydra's reign of terror to a permanent end. The massive body convulsed once, then lay still. The poisonous mist that had hung over the swamp for decades began to dissipate, and for the first time in living memory, pure sunlight touched the waters of Lerna. However, the work was not yet complete. Heracles had learned to be thorough in his labors. He dipped his arrows in the Hydra's blood, creating weapons that would forever carry the monster's venom. These arrows would serve him well in future trials, though they would also bring an unforeseen tragedy to one he cared for deeply. He also took the Hydra's central fang, a curved blade harder than steel and sharp enough to cut through anything, even, as he would later discover, the Nemean lion's hide. These trophies were not just proof of victory. They were tools that would prove indispensable in the trials to come. However, when they returned to Tiryns, Eurystheus awaited them with a cruel surprise. "This labor does not count," he announced from his bronze chamber. "You had an assistant. Iolaus helped you with the torch. The task was to face the Hydra alone." It was a bitter moment for Heracles, compounded by the knowledge that Eurystheus was technically correct. But Iolaus stepped forward and spoke with quiet dignity. "Uncle, we learned something important here. Some monsters cannot be defeated by strength alone. They require friendship, cooperation, and a willingness to trust others. If this disqualifies us from this victory, then perhaps the true victory lies not in pleasing kings. It lies in discovering what truly makes us strong. And perhaps that is the true lesson of the Hydra. Some of life's challenges multiply when we attack them head-on. But when we work together, when we combine our different strengths and cover each other's weaknesses, even the most impossible monsters can be defeated." The question that arises as Heracles prepares for his next trial is this: will he remember this lesson when future challenges demand not only strength, but also wisdom, patience, and the courage to be gentle? After the dispute over the Hydra, a new, more sophisticated calculation emerged in the king's tasks. He understood that brute force might not be enough to humiliate his cousin. Perhaps something more subtle, more cunning, a form of torment, was required. "Your third labor," Eurystheus announced through his speaking tube, his voice carrying a note of peculiar, sinister satisfaction, "is to capture the Ceryneian hind alive and bring it to me unharmed. You have exactly 1 year to accomplish this task." At first, this might have seemed a relief after battles with venom-spitting monsters and regenerating heads. A hind, how hard could that be? But as Heracles listened to the full description of his target, he began to understand the cruel cunning of the task. The Ceryneian hind was no ordinary deer. It was a creature of unthinkable divine beauty, with golden antlers that gleamed like captured sunlight and bronze hooves that chimed like bells as it ran. Most importantly, it was sacred to Artemis, the goddess of the hunt, and it was specifically placed under divine protection. Killing it would incur the wrath of Artemis herself. But here was the truly diabolical part of the trial. The hind was swifter than anything a mortal had ever imagined. It could outrun the wind itself, covering hundreds of miles in a single day without tiring. For a year, Heracles was to pursue this impossible creature, without harming it, knowing that his failure meant not only personal defeat, but also inevitable divine retribution. Picture Heracles as he prepared for this labor, so strikingly different from the brutal battles he had waged before. Instead of weapons and armor, he took with him hunting nets, strong ropes, and provisions for a very long, arduous journey. Iolaus offered to come with him, but Heracles shook his head. "This is something I must do alone," he said. "Not because Eurystheus demands it, but because I need to learn something about myself." The hunt began in the hills around Cerynea, where the hind was most often sighted. Local shepherds whispered of it, describing glimpses of golden light moving through the forest faster than thought. "She's like a piece of the sun that broke off and learned to run," one old woman told Heracles. "Incredibly beautiful, but impossible to catch." For the first few months of his arduous trial, Heracles resorted to his accustomed hunting methods, striving to overtake the elusive hind. He meticulously tracked its footprints, which, thanks to the animal's bronze hooves, were surprisingly clear and easily discernible on the yielding soil. The hero thoroughly studied its favored trails, watering holes and shady meadows where it preferred to graze. However, each time he managed to approach close enough to see it firsthand, the hind would vanish into thin air, like a fleeting golden dream, slipping from his sight. It seemed to be well aware of the pursuit, but instead of fleeing in panic, as ordinary beasts would, there was an almost playful lightness to its evasion. The hind might calmly graze in a sun-drenched meadow until Heracles drew close enough to attempt capture, and then, with extraordinary grace, it would slip away, making movements that seemed pre-rehearsed. At times it would even pause to turn and look back at its pursuer, as if checking if he had fallen behind. Imperceptibly, summer gave way to golden autumn, and then to harsh winter. During these months, Heracles learned the subtleties of nature, discerning the changing seasons by the hind's habits. In the summer months, it preferred the cool of the high meadows, where the grass was lush and abundant. With the arrival of autumn, its path led to the oak groves, where fallen acorns provided easy and abundant sustenance. The winter cold found it in the low-lying valleys, where streams, warmed by underground springs, did not freeze. However, no matter how carefully Heracles studied its habits, he could not overcome that final, elusive barrier. The hind always remained one step ahead, one elusive leap out of reach. For a hero accustomed to solving any problem with brute force and unwavering determination, this constant almost became a sophisticated, yet gentle torment. It was during the long, silent winter nights, alone beneath stars that seemed impossibly distant, that Heracles began to grasp the true meaning of this labor. He was learning patience, not the gritting his teeth perseverance he had always relied on, but a deeper, more serene acceptance of things that could not be rushed. His attention, for the first time, turned to the minutiae of the surrounding world that he had never before noticed, how the morning mist swirled over the streams, the unique quality of light filtering through different kinds of trees, and the changing bird songs with the seasons. For the first time since the tragic loss of his family, Heracles began to find peace in simply being present, rather than in the constant striving to achieve something. With the arrival of spring, a subtle but profound shift occurred in the dynamic between the hunter and his elusive prey. The hind still masterfully evaded capture, yet now there were moments when it did not immediately flee upon Heracles' approach. It might calmly graze while the hero sat perfectly still some 50 yards away, making no move forward or back. These peaceful lulls in the pursuit grew more frequent as the months passed. One morning in late spring, as Heracles sat by a crystal-clear stream, enjoying a humble breakfast of bread and olives, the hind appeared on the opposite bank. It was close enough for him to discern the individual golden hairs of its coat and see the warm, intelligent gleam in its dark eyes. For a long moment they simply looked at each other across the flowing water. Then something truly astonishing happened. The hind gracefully stepped into the stream and began to slowly, confidently cross to his side. Every instinct screamed at Heracles to grab his net, to make a decisive lunge, but somehow he knew that would shatter everything. Instead, he continued to eat his breakfast as if nothing unusual were happening. The hind emerged from the stream and, slowly, cautiously, but utterly without fear, approached him. It came so close that Heracles could have reached out and touched its golden flank, but instead he broke off a piece of bread and offered it to her on an open palm. It cautiously sniffed the offering, then accepted it with surprising gentleness, Its lips were soft against his skin, like the touch of silk. For several minutes, they shared the morning meal in comfortable silence. Hero and sacred hind, predator and prey, had found an unexpected camaraderie in the pursuit that had defined their lives for nearly a year. It was in this moment of perfect stillness that Heracles realized the true nature of his task. He was not to capture the hind by force or clever trap. He was to earn its trust so completely that it would choose to follow him willingly. The labor was not about conquest, but about connection, about relationship. For the subsequent days, this remarkable scenario repeated itself. The hind regularly visited the hero during his stops, readily accepting food from his hands and even allowing him to gently stroke its neck. However, it invariably maintained its independence, never drawing close enough for Heracles to restrain it against its will. Finally, with only a week remaining before his year-long deadline expired, Heracles made a decision that astonished even himself. He approached the hind not with ropes or nets, but with words. "Lady," he addressed it formally, acknowledging its sacred nature. "I require your assistance. I come to you not as a hunter pursuing prey, but as one who asks a favor of a friend." He candidly explained his difficult situation, the arduous labors, his profound guilt over his family's death, and his urgent need for redemption. The hind listened with what appeared to be genuine attention, its head tilted in an almost human gesture of contemplation. When Heracles finished speaking, the hind walked over to him and, to his utter astonishment, calmly lay down at his feet. It offered itself willingly, trusting him completely and believing his promise that it would not be harmed. It was a moment of such pure grace and profound trust that tears welled in Heracles' eyes. The journey back to Tiryns was unlike any of Heracles' previous travels. The hind walked alongside him, like a devoted companion, sometimes running ahead to scout the path, and other times lagging to investigate interesting scents. It could have fled at any moment, yet each time it chose to remain by his side. This conscious choice transformed the very essence of the labor. As they approached the palace, Eurystheus emerged from his underground chamber for the first time since the trials began. The sight of the golden hind, walking freely alongside the hero, was so unexpected that even the cowardly king could not suppress his curiosity. "How did you catch her?" Eurystheus asked, clearly expecting a story of cunning traps or overwhelming force. "I did not capture her," Heracles simply replied. "I asked her to come with me, and she chose to agree. Sometimes the impossible becomes possible when we stop trying to force something to happen and start trying to understand it." As if to confirm these words, the hind approached and touched Eurystheus's hand with its nose, a gesture of greeting, not submission. The king, for all his many flaws, was forced to acknowledge that he was in the presence of something sacred and truly miraculous. However, the labor had to be completed in strict accordance with its conditions, and those conditions demanded the hind be placed under Eurystheus's complete control. This was a moment that challenged everything Heracles had learned about trust and gentleness. How could he both fulfill the letter of his obligation and preserve the spirit of the deep friendship that had blossomed between them? The solution, surprisingly, came from the hind itself. As if understanding the complexity of the dilemma, it allowed Heracles to place a golden collar around its neck, not as a symbol of restraint or subjugation, but as a sign of their mutual agreement. Then, It calmly walked into the royal stables and settled into a stall filled with fresh hay and clean water. It remained there for exactly 3 days, which was sufficient to fulfill all the technical requirements of the labour. Then, on the 4th morning, it simply vanished. The stall was empty, the collar gone, and no trace remained save for a single golden hair found on Heracles' pillow, a silent token of a friendship that would forever remind him of the lessons learned during their year together. Standing in the empty stable, Heracles reflected on what he had gained from this, perhaps the most unusual of his labours. He had learned that some victories are achieved only through true patience, that certain relationships demand deep trust rather than rigid control, and that sometimes the most powerful thing one can do is simply wait for someone to choose to be with you. But even as he savoured these insights, the question of what new trial fate held for him was already forming in his mind. If Eurystheus was growing ever more inventive in his cruelty, what impossible task would now test not only Heracles' physical strength, but the very foundations of who he was becoming? Winter had settled over Greece in a heavy, snowy blanket, and the peaceful memory of the Golden Hind now felt like an echo of a warmer, gentler time. As Heracles approached Eurystheus' palace, his breath plumed in the frosty air, and the snow crunched underfoot with each resolute step. This time, as the king's voice echoed from his bronze, securely hidden chamber, there was a distinct note of disappointment that had not been there before. The labour of the hind had clearly not gone as intended. Eurystheus had hoped to witness Heracles agonizingly struggle with an impossible task, not forge a friendship with his sacred quarry. Now the king was determined to present a trial that would play upon what he perceived as his cousin's greatest weakness, his inherent propensity for violence. "Your 4th labour," Eurystheus solemnly announced, "is to capture the Erymanthian boar alive and bring it to me. This monstrous creature has terrorized the slopes of Mount Erymanthus for years, mercilessly killing anyone who dares to trespass on its territory. You must return it alive, unharmed, and completely under your control." At first glance, this task might have seemed similar to the previous labour of the hind, another mission of capture rather than slaughter. However, there was one fundamental difference between them. The Ceryneian hind was an embodiment of grace and natural intelligence, capable of conscious choice and cooperation. The Erymanthian boar, however, was pure rage given tangible physical form. This monster was so consumed by its ferocity that it attacked anything that moved, including even its own reflection in still water. Imagine, if you will, a creature whose very appearance would inspire primal terror. A wild boar, its size comparable to a small building, possessed tusks curved like deadly scimitars, and its eyes burned with unquenchable fury. The hide of this behemoth, dense as forged armour, was scarred from countless battles with hunters who had fruitlessly attempted to claim it as a trophy. But the most unsettling aspect of its nature was the seemingly genuine pleasure it derived from destruction, deliberately trampling crops and tearing down anything erected by human hands. However, Heracles, having endured a series of recent labours, had learned a crucial lesson. Brute force is not always the universal solution, and sometimes the most obvious approach proves the least productive. Preparing for his impending journey to Mount Erymanthus, he took with him not only his usual weaponry but also ropes, nets, and various tools designed for capture, not slaughter. His path led him through some of the most picturesque winter landscapes one could find in Greece. Snow-capped mountain peaks loomed like sleeping giants against a sky so blue it seemed painted. Pine trees stood draped in white caps of snow, and streams rushed their dark waters between banks covered in pristine snow. This place could have served as an ideal sanctuary for contemplation and tranquility, were it not for the increasingly evident signs of the boar's presence. As Heracles ascended higher into the mountains, the evidence of the creature's rage became utterly undeniable. Entire groves of trees had been felled, their mighty trunks snapped like brittle twigs. Boulders the size of entire houses had been dislodged from their ancient, millennia-old resting places. Even the mountain landscape itself seemed to bear the scars of the boar's destructive fury. But the true horror emanating from this creature only became apparent when Heracles stumbled upon his first human victim. An abandoned hunter's camp, clearly deserted in haste, told a story of frantic terror and despair. Equipment was strewn everywhere, as if discarded in mid-flight. The campfire had burned down to cold ash, and the tracks in the snow unequivocally indicated where someone had fled in panic towards the lower valleys. Heracles followed these tracks and eventually found the hunter, a middle-aged man named Pholus who had taken refuge in a cave with several other survivors. They greeted Heracles with the desperate gratitude of people who had lived in constant fear for weeks. "This is no mere animal," Pholus explained as they sat around a small fire that night. "Animals kill for food, for territory, or in self-defense. This creature kills for the sheer pleasure of it. I've seen it chase deer for miles, not to eat them, but just to experience the thrill of the hunt. And when it catches them—" He shuddered, unable to finish the sentence. From these survivors, Heracles gathered crucial details about the boar's behavior. The creature was most active during storms, as if the chaos of wind and snow fueled its rage. It had no permanent lair. The boar preferred to roam the mountain slopes continuously, and most importantly, it seemed to grow larger and more aggressive with each passing month, as if its own fury served as a source of its growth. Armed with this valuable information, Heracles commenced his hunt, patiently awaiting favorable weather conditions. When a fierce blizzard descended upon the mountain, he took up position in a narrow valley that the boar frequently used as a travel route. His plan relied on observation and patience, rather than direct confrontation skills he had only recently begun to develop. The boar emerged through the swirling snow like a dark nightmare. Its massive figure was barely discernible until it approached within striking distance. But instead of meeting it head-on, Heracles did something entirely unexpected. He retreated, not out of fear, but strategically, luring the creature towards a trap he had been preparing for several days. You see, Heracles had noted that the boar's fury made it predictable. When it saw potential prey, it immediately and directly attacked, never considering that this might be precisely what its adversary desired. By feigning retreat, Heracles provoked the creature's pursuit instinct while maintaining complete control over the direction of the chase. The trap was elegant in its simplicity. Higher in the mountains, Heracles had discovered a natural depression filled with deep snow, so deep that even the massive boar would sink into it and become trapped. The challenge was to reach this depression while staying ahead of a creature capable of running faster than a horse, despite its size. The chase through the blizzard became an epic test of endurance and wilderness skill. Heracles leapt from rock to rock, slid down snowy slopes, and utilized every advantage the landscape offered. Behind him, the boar tore through the forest, like a living avalanche, its rage escalating with each passing minute that its prey remained out of reach. But Heracles had calculated the distance with perfect precision. Just as his own strength began to wane, he reached the edge of the snowy depression. Without hesitation, he leapt across the chasm to the solid ground on the far side. The boar, driven by pure rage and unable to halt its charge, plunged directly into the deep snow. What followed was almost comical. The great monster that had terrorized an entire region found itself stuck, like a massive, angry piglet. Its fury only worsened the situation. Every twitch and struggle drove it deeper into the soft snow. After a few minutes, only its head and the tips of its tusks were visible. But now came the truly difficult part. Extracting the creature from the snow and delivering it to Tiryns without being killed in the process. The trapped boar still posed a deadly threat, and it was now raging mad from being outsmarted by a mere man. Heracles solved this problem by employing a combination of engineering and psychology, carefully working around the creature's limited range of movement. He constructed a wooden cage directly around the boar while it was still trapped in the snow. It was painstaking work. Each plank had to be positioned with exquisite precision to avoid those slashing tusks. But in the end, he had created a mobile prison sturdy enough to contain even this monster. The psychological part came when it was time to excavate the boar from the snow. Instead of simply freeing it into the cage, Heracles constantly talked to the creature as he worked. He didn't expect understanding, but hoped the sound of a calm, steady voice might have some effect on its rage-addled mind. "Calm down, friend," he would say, brushing snow from the boar's massive sides. "I know you're angry, and you have every right to be. Being trapped is frightening, but I am not here to hurt you. I am here to give you a chance to be something more than just an engine of destruction." Whether the boar truly understood or simply exhausted itself through struggling, something remarkable happened during the long excavation process. The creature's constant roaring and thrashing gradually subsided. By the time Heracles cleared the last of the snow, the boar was calm, watching him with eyes that still burned with fury, but also displayed a glimmer of what might have been curiosity. The journey back to Tiryns took weeks, and it became a lesson for both hero and monster. Heracles learned that even the most enraged creature has needs beyond destruction, needs for food, shelter, and something that could almost be called companionship. The boar, for its part, seemed to discover that not all humans were enemies to be annihilated. By the time they reached the palace, something unprecedented had occurred. The Erymanthian boar, still in its cage but no longer thrashing against the bars, allowed Heracles to approach close enough to scratch it behind the ears. It was still a dangerous creature. Those tusks could rip a man open in seconds. But the constant fury had been replaced by something akin to peace. Eurystheus, observing from his bronze chamber through a periscope, could barely believe his eyes. "How?" he demanded an explanation. "How did you turn a monster into what this is?" Heracles carefully considered the question before answering. "I think, perhaps, it was never a monster. Perhaps it was simply a creature that had been hurt and scared for so long that rage became the only way it knew how to deal with the world. When I showed it that not everything had to be a fight, it remembered there were other ways to be." The boar lived out its days in a specially constructed enclosure in the royal gardens, where it became something of an attraction. Children would come to feed it apples and watch it wallow in the mud. It never again displayed the destructive fury that had once terrorized Mount Erymanthus. But as Heracles watched this peaceful scene, he couldn't help but ponder the lessons hidden in this labor. If even the most violent creature can find peace when treated with patience and respect, what does that say about human nature? What does it suggest about the possibility of redemption for one who has committed terrible things? And perhaps most importantly, as he prepared for his next trial, what happens when what needs to be calmed is not a monster, but the corruption and filth that accumulate when people stop caring about the consequences of their actions? The quiet image of the transformed boar, peacefully grazing in the royal gardens, still stood vividly in Heracles' mind when Eurystheus summoned him again, this time for the 5th of the 12 labors. However, in the king's voice now sounded something different. There was a note of peculiar satisfaction that eloquently hinted that this upcoming trial might prove to be the most humiliating of all the preceding ones. "Your next task," Eurystheus proclaimed from his bronze chamber, his words imbued with blatant glee, "is to clean the stables of King Augeas in a single day, every last bit to pristine cleanliness." Now, one might wonder why the mere cleaning of stables was deemed a fitting task for the greatest hero of all Hellas. But Eurystheus, undoubtedly, had done his research thoroughly, and was well aware of precisely what he was asking. King Augeas, ruler of Elis, owned a truly incalculable number of cattle, surpassing any other holding in the world. 3,000 head of the finest livestock ever to exist. And astonishingly, he had never, not once in 30 full years, bothered to clean their stables. Imagine, if it's even possible, the monstrous amount of filth accumulated from 3,000 head of cattle over 3 decades. The stables were not merely dirty, they were veritable geological formations of dung, layer upon layer of waste that had accumulated until the original floor was buried under 30 feet of foul matter. The stench from this spectacle could be smelled for miles, and the swarms of flies, continuously circling the stables, formed dense clouds visible from neighboring kingdoms. But the true genius of Eurystheus's cruelty lay in the time limit. One day, a task that would have taken hundreds of men months to complete had to be finished between sunrise and sunset by a single individual. This was not merely physically impossible. It was designed to utterly demoralize the hero, to reduce him to the level of the lowest servant, stripping him of all dignity. As Heracles made his way to Elis, he had ample time for deep reflection on the implications of this unprecedented labor. His previous tasks had tested his unbreakable strength, unparalleled courage, remarkable patience, and wisdom. This one, however, seemed designed solely to humiliate him, to trample his pride. But perhaps that was precisely what made it so significant. Perhaps learning to find dignity even in the most humble and unsightly work was an integral part of his path to redemption. The unbearable stench reached him long before he could see the stables themselves. It was a stench so profound and complex that it seemed to have its own layers. The sharp, acrid smell of fresh waste, the earthy richness of a decade's decomposition, and beneath it all, something so fundamentally rotten that it made one's eyes water and stomach churn involuntarily. When Heracles finally arrived at King Augeas' palace, he found a ruler who was genuinely embarrassed by his infamous negligence. Augeas, in many ways, was a kind and decent man, generous to his guests, fair to his subjects, known for the high quality of his cattle. But somehow the task of cleaning the stables had always been put off until tomorrow, and that tomorrow had inexorably turned into 30 years. "I know how this looks," Algaius said, not quite meeting Heracles' gaze as they surveyed the monumental mess. "I kept meaning to hire men to deal with it, but the job became so colossal that I simply didn't know where to begin. And the expense. You know how much it would cost to hire enough labourers to clear all this." Heracles walked through the stables, or at least he tried to. In most places, the accumulated waste reached almost to the roof, leaving only narrow passages between towering walls of filth. The cattle themselves seemed to have adapted to such a life, mostly dwelling outside and using the stables only in the worst weather. The animals appeared healthy enough, but the waste from their daily lives only added to the ever-growing problem. Standing amidst this colossal monument to procrastination, Heracles faced a true crisis of approach. His usual methods, brute force, unyielding determination, direct action, would be utterly inadequate here. Even if he worked without rest from dawn to dusk, he could not move a tenth of this mess by hand. This labour demanded something entirely different. Innovation. Heracles spent the rest of the day circling the lands around the stables, studying the geography of the area with the eyes of an engineer, not a warrior. He noticed that 2 rivers, the Alpheus and the Peneus, flowed relatively close to the stables. More importantly, he clearly saw that with some creative earthworks their courses could be temporarily altered to flow directly through the fouled buildings. That same evening he presented his audacious plan to King Algaius. "I can clean your stables in a single day," he stated, "but I will need assistance with the preparation. Give me 50 of your men for the night, and by tomorrow evening your stables will be spotless." Algaius, desperate after decades of embarrassment and shame, immediately agreed. "If you can truly accomplish this miracle," he said, "I will give you 1/10 of my cattle as payment, 300 of the finest animals in all of Hellas." Heracles accepted the offer, though he knew full well he could not actually keep the payment. The labours were for penance, not personal gain, but the promise served as an additional motivation to secure the necessary assistance. All night long, Heracles and the 50 labourers dug with such focus and intensity that it astonished even these men, accustomed as they were to hard work. They weren't just moving earth, they were reshaping the very landscape, creating deep channels that would divert 2 major rivers towards a single objective. The work was grueling, but there was something deeply satisfying about it. These men had lived for years with the shame of their king's filthy stables, unable to address the problem due to its colossal scale. Now, finally, they were taking action that they hoped would solve the problem permanently. At dawn, the final preparations were complete. 2 meticulously engineered channels led from the rivers to the stables with massive wooden gates ready to control the powerful flow of water. Additional channels on the far side were designed to carry the water and everything it washed away safely downstream to areas where the waste could actually benefit the land as valuable fertilizer. The moment of truth arrived as the sun reached its highest point. Heracles and his assistants simultaneously opened the gates, and the combined might of the 2 rivers surged through the stables of Algaius like a cleansing deluge. What happened next was both spectacular and deeply satisfying to witness. 30 years of accumulated filth were washed away in a matter of hours. The rushing water scoured the original floors, revealed walls that hadn't seen daylight in decades, and carried away the monumental mess that had seemed utterly impossible to clear. But this was not mere destruction. It was true renewal. As the torrent of water continued to rush through the stables, it performed something remarkable. The ancient accumulation of waste, mixed with the swiftly flowing river water, was transforming into rich fertilizer that would greatly benefit farmlands for miles downstream. The corruption that had seemed merely an insurmountable problem was being turned into something useful and valuable. By midday, the work was entirely complete. Where stables once stood, so foul they could be smelled from neighboring kingdoms, now gleamed clean buildings with stone floors, glistening with moisture in the midday sun. The rivers were returned to their original courses, leaving behind structures that were not just clean, but renewed. King Augeas was so overcome with joy and relief that he actually wept. 30 years, he kept repeating, 30 years I've lived with this disgrace, and you have resolved it in a single day. He immediately ordered his men to bring the 300 finest animals, keeping his promise of payment. But here Heracles faced an unexpected dilemma. He had completed the labor precisely as instructed. The stables were clean, the work was finished in a day, and he had accomplished it largely through his own efforts and strategic planning. But he had also made an agreement with Augeas that would bring him personal gain, which seemed to violate the spirit of penance that the labors represented. After much agonizing deliberation, Heracles made a decision that surprised everyone, including himself. He accepted the cattle but immediately distributed them. Some to the laborers who had helped with the earthworks, others to poor farmers in the region who needed livestock to support their families. He kept nothing for himself. When news of this reached Eurystheus, the king's reaction was swift and predictable. "This labor does not count," he declared. "Heracles was paid for the work, which makes it a commercial transaction, not a penance. Furthermore, he used the rivers for most of the actual cleaning, which means he did not accomplish the task through his own efforts." It was a harsh judgment, compounded by its technical accuracy. But as Heracles prepared to leave, King Augeas drew him aside for a private conversation. "I don't care what your cousin says," Augeas said quietly. "What?"